Hey, so these videos on House of the Dragon have been doing pretty poorly, to be perfectly honest, shockingly badly, and that's fine. Some videos just don't do that well, but I think I might have overestimated the interest my audience has in House of the Dragon or wider Game of Thrones discussions, and that's okay. I mean, it's disappointing, but it's part of the job, right? But that does mean that all the future episodes discussing House of the Dragon are going to be taking place on my second channel, To the Future, which is linked down in the comments below. I don't want to overload the main channel with stuff that you guys aren't so invested in, and it's just not financially viable for me to keep doing it the way that I currently am. Share and like and comment and subscribe. Those all help immensely, sharing it around and so on. But I will continue talking about the show over on the second channel, and there's a lot more Willow and Momo over on the second channel, so go subscribe to that. The second episode of House of the Dragon puts character and political machinations front and center. It opens with a new intro, and like how the one in Game of Thrones takes us across the sprawling locations of Westeros and Essos, House of the Dragon guides us through the Targaryen family tree from the Doom of Valyria to Rhaenyra, with blood flowing from cog to cog, representing each person, each level a new generation, before they all pour into a pit of fire and blood. All these trails lead nowhere and instead fuel this bloody inferno that is the Dance of Dragons, growing larger with every death and betrayal and drop of blood drawn. I actually have a full video discussing it in detail because there's a lot of depth to it, and it's linked up in the corner. Though I will admit that while I appreciated the opening, I think it lacks the clarity that the original had perhaps, and it doesn't communicate quite as much information as it could. It could do with a bit of brightening up, you might say. We then open up to a skin-crawling scene, quite literally. Survivors of a battle down in the Stepstones have been nailed to poles and left to be eaten alive by thousands of crabs. The Stepstones are an archipelago that's spread from Dawn to Essos, and it's notoriously filled with pirates. In episode 1, Corlys warns of the Triarchy, an alliance between the free cities of Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh. And in particular, he warns of Kragas Drahar, the crab feeder, due to his inventive methods of punishing his enemies. In the books, he's said to have staked out hundreds of captured pirates to drown them beneath the rising tide. And that is precisely what we're seeing here. Gotta love George R. R. Martin's creativity with this stuff. Now, the Stepstones themselves are worthless. They don't have any resources. They're bleak and stony, but they represent a vital shipping route to most of Essos, and if the Triarchy were allowed to control them, then they would in effect control the trade passing through them. Corlys Velaryon in particular is upset by this because he made House Velaryon the richest in Westeros by trading with the distant cities of Essos, and now he's losing his ships to this crab feeder. Viserys resists Corlys. He says that it's his obligation to avoid war unless it is absolutely necessary. And Otto minimizes Corlys's concerns here. He says, hey, you'll be compensated, you'll be fine, shut up. Otto is a really interesting character because everything he does in these first couple of episodes could be construed in multiple different ways. Here he's avoiding war, but it could be also read as him weakening House Velaryon and driving Corlys further from Viserys, giving himself more influence over the king. Rhaenyra protests in this meeting that, hey, they have dragons, they should use them, burn them all, showing that she has a proclivity for action and even violence that Viserys does not, but she's sent away, she's dismissed. And then, when Otto brings up how Daemon has occupied Dragonstone unchallenged for half a year now, Viserys ignores that as well. He says, no, we're not going near that. He pushes the conversation back to talking about the Stepstones. See, where other kings and queens have failed because they acted too rashly or boldly, Viserys shows us how being too cautious or ignoring problems for what they are, preferring to be liked and calm, can make those problems worse too. They allow them to grow and fester until they're too big to control. This is almost symbolically reflected in the injuries we see Viserys getting treated for in both episodes. A cut that he insists they shouldn't have to worry about, kind of like the Stepstones, and then a rotting finger that he's trying to save rather than amputate in the second, kind of like Daemon. He lets these wounds fester when a more aggressive approach might be needed, and in time, it might be too late to stop them when he finally decides to act. Now, this, in a way, is exactly the sort of conflict the Dance of Dragons is. The seeds are being sown and they could be stopped, but Viserys doesn't have the strength to really do it. See, Daemon at this point has taken Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen. Symbols are important to the Targaryens, like the fact that Viserys flew Balerion, Aegon the Conqueror's huge black dragon, was an important symbol at the Grand Council that helped him secure the throne. Dragonstone is another of those important symbols. The heir to the Iron Throne is typically named Prince of Dragonstone, so Daemon squatting there unchallenged could be read as tacit acceptance of his claim to the crown. He sends Viserys a letter claiming to be the rightful heir, that he's taken a new wife in Mysaria, this woman from Lys, who is supposedly pregnant, and he's stolen a dragon egg. This egg came from Dreamfire, Rhaena Targaryen's dragon, and the very same egg that was placed with Balon, Viserys' infant son, who died in the first episode alongside Aemma, Viserys' wife. Again, Viserys only really acts and gets angry when it comes to family. He woke his brother's wrath, we read. Viserys announces that he will go to Dragonstone himself to put an end to this, but Otto insists that no, you don't do that, I'll go instead. Again, this is one of those decisions that could be read as charitable or furthering his own influence and power. Maybe it's to keep the king safe, but maybe it's to further isolate Viserys from Daemon, someone who really would be loyal to him if given the chance, just like Otto is doing to Corlys Velaryon, and to keep the king closer to him and House Hightower. Interestingly, in Fire and Blood, Otto really came across to me as the sort of man who, well, he doesn't go to the front lines, right? At one point he's told, "Thrones are won with swords, not quills. Spill blood, not ink." Otto is a negotiator, an organizer, an influencer. An influencer? Sorry, I just have to laugh at that term, like Otto the TikToker. But hey, this could suggest a more heroic streak as well. I don't know in the show, you know? Especially when this means he's going up against a man who he knows hates him, and he knows has a dragon called the Bloodworm. I mean, how do you interpret this moment? Is Otto heroic, brave, manipulating? I don't know. I want to hear your thoughts. The book itself is actually pretty sparse in detail on this scene. I mean, it doesn't even mention Otto or Rhaenyra or Kristen Cole, but remember, Fire and Blood is a history book, written with biases and missing details all over the place. It's not an objective account of these historical events. Because of this, the book does say that Daemon had a child with Mysaria, who later died, but the show demonstrates that Daemon was just lying straight up about the kid, right? Like, it makes sense that this detail ends up in the book, because the Maesters would have only had access to the letter that Daemon sent, and not this private conversation we see later between Mysaria and Daemon. Some details would just never have made it back to the Maesters. Daemon's motivations are complicated, right? You can interpret him in so many ways, and that is what I love about him. That he just wants to get Viserys' attention, his brother whom he loves, that he wants recognition inside the architecture of the Targaryen family, or that he is truly after the throne himself, that he wants some semblance of power, but he'll settle for anything. This whole episode is littered with hints that he is truly unquestionably loyal to his family. The smirk when Rhaenyra turns up says that this is all kind of a game, and Mysaria even calls it a game later on, when he tells Corlys that, I may speak of my brother how I like, you may not. It's very much that kind of, I can beat my brother up, but you can't kind of relationship. And that's really cool, that's really unique. Also, I gotta say one thing about the dragons. They are magnificent. We've only seen a few so far. Caraxes and Syrax are visibly and audibly distinct from each other in just fantastic ways. They have different personalities and feels to them, you know, like he's called the Bloodworm, and he kind of looks long and slithering even when he flies, and I think that's great. We didn't really get this with Game of Thrones, and I am so excited to see all 21 that are gonna pop up all across the Dance of Dragons. Now, the scene with Mysaria takes place in the same room that we see Stannis and Daenerys in during Game of Thrones. Gotta ask, where is the painted table, Aegon's huge map of Westeros? I cannot imagine that it is easy to move, given it is, quote, 50 feet long. Now, in Fire and Blood, Mysaria's motivations are a mystery a lot of the time, to be perfectly honest. She plays both sides to certain ends. We're not given much inside her mind at all. It's everyone sort of abstracting their ideas about what she's like from the outside. So this one line from her is the first real gauge we have of her character, and it's quite sympathetic, which was surprising to me, that she didn't join Daemon for money or station or power, but freedom from fear. This is really interesting, seeing that softer side to her, because honestly, the books paint her in a really dark light, and I want to see where this line, this moral thinking kind of takes her. Rhaenyra is sent off to help pick the new Kingsguardsman, and she picks Sir Criston Cole, the same knight that we saw Daemon beat in the very first episode, and the only one who has seen any real combat experience. See, King Jaehaerys ruled for some 60 years in what was a time of peace and prosperity, so knights didn't have much fighting to do. Well, except Dorne isn't a part of the Seven Kingdoms at this point, so it's kinda 6 kingdoms at the moment. They resisted Aegon's initial conquest by simply never meeting the Targaryens in the field. And there's a history of Dornish outlaws who call themselves Vulture Kings, who rise up in the Red Mountains to attack the south of Westeros. Historically, one of those Vulture Kings even destroyed Sir Criston's home. Criston, quote, fought for a year as a foot soldier against the Dornish incursions along the Boneway. The Dornish marches are the border between the Stormlands, the Reach, and Dorne, while the Boneway is a pass that runs through the Red Mountains. So Criston Cole likely fought one of these Vulture Kings, possibly one that wasn't recorded, but it's that sort of regular border conflict that we see across history in Westeros. Because there's this ongoing kind of resentment for the other kingdoms all through Dawn after what happened in that brutal war. This episode also revolves around Viserys picking a new wife. With only one heir before Daemon gets the throne, Viserys, Corlys, Rhaenys, and Otto are all pretty damn keen to ensure that there are more heirs to get in the way. Corlys and Rhaenys pressure him to choose Laena Velaryon, their 12-year-old daughter. See, the Targaryens and Velaryons have a long incestuous history going back generations of marriages, and with them being one of the most powerful and richest houses in the realm, and Corlys seemingly turning on the crown a little bit at the moment, everyone from Lionel Strong, the entirety of the Small Council, the Grand Maester, Corlys, Rhaenys, well, they all tell Viserys that this would be a way to create stability and continuity for the future. Even Otto Hightower admits that this could be a good idea, though again, this moment could be construed as him manipulating the king. He admits the Grand Maester's reasoning is sound, but to be compelled to replace Emma for duty's sake, you are the king, but I do not envy you. Otto brings up love and sentiment here, knowing full well that Viserys and Alicent Hightower, Otto's daughter, have been spending a lot of time together, and Otto does seem to be trying to push his daughter into this role to offer herself as his new wife. So these comments about love and sentiment are playing to Viserys' weaknesses, and it subtly places Alicent back in his mind as a viable option. Alicent and Viserys bond over a large-scale model of the old Valyrian freehold, the same model that we actually see in the opening credits. The Targaryens idolize and idealize the Valyrians, despite the fact that they were a brutal and ruthless slave-owning empire who burned thousands and thousands of people, sometimes just for fun. Even Viserys, who developed a dislike for dragons, admits that the glory of old Valyria will never be seen again. It's kind of like, you know, those people who idealize the British Empire. He tells Alicent about a tower where blood mages worked, which he calls the Anogrion. The first part of that word comes from Anogar, meaning blood in Old Valyrian. Valyria was destroyed in a vast cataclysmic eruption of 14 volcanoes. There are lots of theories about how this happened, but all of them have a sense that this was caused by the Valyrians' own hubris, that they flew too high to the sun and were struck down. In a way, the doom parallels the Dance of Dragons here. There's a cyclicalness to history, which is something that George R. R. Martin is a real fan of thematically. He sees that the might, height, and power of House Targaryen brings itself down low. But once again, when it comes to picking a new wife, Viserys just doesn't seem capable of making those hard decisions that the realm needs. As Daemon says at the end of the episode, you know, my brother was never very good at that, and Corlys says, at what? And he says, being king. See, Viserys picks Alicent Hightower. Corlys protests. This is an absurdity. But Viserys tells him, I am your king, which is an interesting line because, you know, people have told him over and over across these episodes that, you know, he has to make these decisions. It's on his shoulders. And when he does, finally as king, it's not his best decision. That's kind of a recurring theme. When he actually takes action purely of his own initiative, it often doesn't turn out that well. Fire and Blood tells us that Viserys relied greatly on the counsel of the men around him and did as they bade more oft than not, but in this instance, no amount of argument would sway him from his course. See, this decision, like many others, lets the wound of House Velaryon fester even more. It snubs Corlys again when nothing less than a direct line to the Iron Throne will satisfy him. First Laenor, then Rhaenys, now Laena. It pushes that wedge between Viserys and Rhaenyra even deeper, who didn't know about this and probably should have, and it spites Daemon even further. So, in the books, you kind of get the impression that Alicent is at least willing or wanting this, but I think they did a really good job of demonstrating how women in this world are manipulated into these roles, and their apprehension or reluctance is just erased in the history books. Like, on the one hand, Alicent wants to do her father Otto proud, she wants to play her role, she is kind of a rule follower. But on the other, she's a nervous wreck, and she's awkwardly looking around when it's announced she'll be his wife, the spotlight's on her. She has fallen into this role more than she has chosen it. One other scene brings Rhaenyra and Rhaenys together to talk about how a possible new son would mean that Rhaenyra's claim to the throne could be thrown into doubt. Rhaenyra tells her, when I am queen, I will create a new order. Which kind of sounds pretty similar, right, to what Daenerys says in Game of Thrones. I'm not going to stop the wheel, I'm going to break the wheel. Both Daenerys and Rhaenyra are intent on undoing an unjust system, but we read in A Song of Ice and Fire how this virtuous goal can end up disastrously. Daenerys abolishes the slave system found in a lot of cities in Essos, but without anything to replace it, without any infrastructure or system, the region just falls into starvation, disease, rebellion, and war. It is Hobbes's nasty, brutish, and short life. It's hell. Daenerys' theme runs counter to a lot of the common fantasy narratives, that a virtuous king or queen does not necessarily make them a good ruler. Targaryens have a history of seeing themselves as the exception, the chosen one, the liberators, the world changers. There's an arrogance to them that sees so many of them destroyed over and over. And we'll just have to wait and see where Rhaenyra's virtuous quest ends. I will mention one thing about the dialogue in this, right? I think it's good. I think it's mostly good, but I think I just want a bit more character in it. Like, Tywin and Robert Baratheon and Cersei and Ned all spoke really differently. Like, every line, you could kind of tell who was saying it just by the words, right? And I want a bit more of that. People sound sometimes a little bit too similar. Sometimes also lines could be better phrased. Like, Rhaenyra says, It pleases me to hear you say this when she's having a touching moment with Viserys, when Viserys is sharing his grief, but Rhaenyra up until this point hasn't been a particularly formal speaker, especially not around her father. She's more likely to say, I could never tell what was going through your mind. You didn't speak to me. It's just nice to know I'm not the only one. See, the final scene is one of Corlys back at Driftmark, the island of House Velaryon. He offers Daemon an alliance to deal with the crab feeder in the Stepstones. Episode 2 sees Viserys growing ever more isolated and those tensions heightening even further as the king allows the wounds, his own and the realm's, to fester. Viserys against Corlys and Daemon, Daemon against Otto, Rhaenyra and Alicent, Corlys and the crab feeder. Which, by the way, I love the design of the crab feeder. That is just, ooh, love it. Absolutely gorgeous. Maybe grayscale? I don't know. Looks really weird, but great design. We'll just have to see where these tensions take us in the future. And